So we did the survey of everybody after the last meeting in November, and biomass came up as the clear winner of what folks wanted to talk about. Lots of other things too. So we put together a meeting on biomass energy. Uh, so here we are, and uh, some of you. So I've lined up some. I've twisted some arms. Is mostly what I've done. For some of the speakers today, but some of you probably remember that Manomet led a team study of greenhouse gas emissions of wood energy for Massachusetts Department of Energy Resources back in 2010. I was president of Manomet at that time, though I wasn't a member of the research team. It damn sure took up a lot of my time for a year or so. And I remember kicking off, Tom and John Gunn were both there. I remember kicking off a meeting, I think it was in Springfield, Massachusetts in December of 2009. I've never had a meeting where armed police were present before, but it's the only meeting I've ever organized that had armed guards present. So that was the biomass issue in Massachusetts back in 2009, 2010. Anyway, the Tom and John and the team did a really fantastic job in 6 months to try to unravel the greenhouse gas emissions of wood biomass energy for DOER. And in like 6 months, they did an enormous amount of work to figure this out and discovered a lot of the fundamental levers that influence the emissions of greenhouse gases from biomass energy. And I don't think those, Tom can fill us in, but I don't think those factors have much changed since then. They are different in different geographies, but the basic levers haven't changed. So we're going to hear about those levers today, and we can all think about how it might be, those might be relevant to Maine, or what they might mean for Maine's biomass energy. Then John Gunn, who is also on the team and can address a lot of the things that you might have about the forest modeling and growth. But I wanted John to talk about home pellet energy in particular, just to take these principles and try to apply them to one particular biomass energy scenario, so we can sort of practice putting the factors to use in a real situation. And then of Ken, of course, is going to do what Ken always does, which helps us understand harvest trends in Maine, historical harvest trends in Maine today, in particular with reference to biomass. So we got three great speakers, perfect for what we need today. And let me just pause and say, any questions so far? And if not, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tom. Tom, your screen is up, and help us out, please. And I'm sorry, I apologize for bringing you back 10 years later.
Well, thanks, John.
You were needed.
I'm kind of amazed I agreed to do this. The biomass project was a fascinating but sometimes painful experience to go through. I think your example of the armed police being at the meeting kind of gives a sense of how much tension there existed around this project right from the beginning. And in many ways, it only got worse after we presented our results. They made a lot of people unhappy. I think, you know, I'm amazed we're still talking about the issue, but as I went back and reread the report, in a lot of ways, I'm not amazed, because I kind of remembered how complicated an issue this is. And it's not surprising that we're still trying to get our hands and minds around it. So kind of without any further ado, let me dive in a little bit. And I'm really going to try to keep it simple today, in part because we don't have a lot of time, and in part because after 10 years, I've forgotten a lot. And unless I keep it simple, you'll probably realize how much I've forgotten. So I'm going to try to give you a basic overview of the concepts and how we thought about biomass in the Manomet study, and talk a little bit about how I think those concepts have held up over time. it's going to include a review of, what really matters when you think about biomass and biomass policy. And I'm going to try to talk a little bit about, what are some remaining issues that we're still talking about today, and, how those ought to get considered in moving forward. Because I don't think the biomass issue has really been resolved. I think there are things still going on that, need to get talked about and addressed. So that's kind of the overview here. The Manomet project, when it started, had three objectives that were laid out by the state. One was to figure out what are the atmospheric greenhouse gas implications of shifting from fossil fuels to a greater reliance on biomass energy production generation. The second was a look at how much wood is available in Massachusetts to support biomass plants. And, there was a real kind of panic amongst people, some people in the state about, if all these biomass plants get built that people are talking about, we're going to have a rolling clear cut from the Berkshires to Boston, was the way it was described. And, in some ways, I think we concluded that was a ludicrous concept, but that was the kind of language that was out there at the time. And the third objective of the study from the state's point of view was, what are the ecological impacts of removing additional biomass from the forests? And is that something that, the state will need to implement policy changes to ensure that forests remain healthy with increased biomass harvesting? We addressed all those issues in the study, but when we went public, all you heard about was wood is worse than coal. And that was kind of the theme. But there's also a lot of information in there about potential biomass supplies and about ecological impacts of biomass harvesting. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to focus on the greenhouse gas issues because I think those are the ones that are more general in a sense. The others are, I guess the forest health issues are more general, but the biomass greenhouse gas issues are the ones that have dominated I think the conversation for the past 10 years. So I'm going to focus on that. Just a couple of things about the team. The team was multifaceted. We've got John Gunn here who led up the forest modeling. I handled the greenhouse gas estimates. Peter Cartalicchio, who used to work for Resource Information Systems, led up the forest supply work. Bob Purcell led the forest ecological work. And we had people from the Biomass Energy Resource Center in Vermont that sort of led the technological aspects of the project. So it was a kind of broad-based team that did this work. We also had an expert panel that we recruited to kind of review our work and give us some outside perspective on what we were doing, so we didn't stare too deeply into our own navels. We were, I think we had a sense this work would get a lot of attention, and we tried to make sure we had some external guidance on this. It was helpful to us, but it didn't reduce the controversial nature of the report once it went public. Okay, so now why don't I get into some kind of basic concepts here. Whoop.
Yep. Oops, you went one. There you go.
All right, I think I've already gone over this. So the first thing I want to do is really talk about some of the key kind of underlying framework issues that are important to understand if you really want to understand biomass. And I think probably the most important piece to get your mind around initially is how we frame the problem. Before the Manomet study came out, I think people were, kind of quick to think biomass energy is carbon neutral. That was the sort of underlying paradigm at that time. And it was basically a kind of based on a general sense that, well, we're burning forest, naturally grown material and comes out of forests, and forests grow back, and as part of the natural cycle, therefore, it should be good for the climate. And, that was just generally kind of taken at face value. And I think, we feel like there's probably more nuance to that than meets the eye going into this project. And we wanted to examine that more rigorously. And I come from an economics and policy analysis background. And I think from my perspective, we needed to put this in a more rigorous policy analysis framework. And the way we did that was to think about this in terms of kind of a reference or business as usual scenario, a world that would exist without increasing bioenergy, and compare that to a world where we ramped up bioenergy in the future, and look at how that affected the atmosphere over time. So we constructed this this business as usual versus a bioenergy kind of framework, and analyzed that. And that sort of drove our whole approach to the issue. And a lot of people, I think, when the study came out, had a hard time kind of getting their minds around that. But that is the basis for all the analysis that we did of greenhouse gas. And I'm going to take you through some basic charts here that kind of show you how we implemented that. And I'm going to ask you to put off questions until I get done here, because I've sort of found in the past that if I open it up to questions along the way, we kind of end up often going down the rabbit hole, and we never come out, and I never get to finish the presentation. So in this case, if you can jot down your questions, I'm happy to come back and answer them. But let me barge ahead here and try to finish quickly, and then we can come back. On this graph, on the top line, well, the x-axis is time, and the y-axis represents tons of carbon. And the top line you see here represents a forest that's been harvested at time 0 and is growing back over time. And that forest is basically the business as usual harvest. And we defined that as a harvest that didn't remove material for bioenergy. And you can see over a roughly 100-year period, this forest, which might have had 40 tons of carbon removed from it, recovers from a level of 70 tons of carbon back to roughly 100 tons, 110 tons of carbon over time. We then posit that, okay, there's a bioenergy scenario where we intensify the harvest in that same area, and we remove an additional 20 tons of carbon in that harvest through tops and limbs, additional removal of cull trees, and other material. And John Gunn, through using the FVS model, modeled the recovery of that stand under a variety of different scenarios, but modeled the recovery of that stand. And you can see over time that opening up of the stand allowed it to recover basically back to the same point over that 100-year period. And in that initial harvest, we took out 20 additional tons of carbon. And the bottom line, it gives the kind of impact on the atmosphere of burning that carbon at a bioenergy plant. So you see at time 0, the 20 tons are emitted to the atmosphere. And as that forest grows back in the business as usual scenario, that carbon in the atmosphere is resequestered in the forest. So this is kind of the basic kind of biophysics of the forest regrowing and the carbon emitted to the atmosphere and then being taken up again by the forest over time. And that's sort of our starting point with the BAU and the bioenergy scenario. And we modeled this across a wide array of different stand types and different types of bioenergy facilities. We looked at electricity facilities, burning gas, burning coal, burning oil. We looked at thermal facilities. We looked at CHP facilities. So that was kind of the range of things we looked at. Now, imagine here, I'm going to switch over and talk a little bit more about that atmospheric curve with respect to different kinds of technologies. So the next graph is going to shift that bottom curve or provide it a little more detail on it. What's happening here? Here we go. Okay. So in this graph, I'm trying to show some of the characteristics of what happens when you burn that biomass in different kinds of facilities over time. And this is where we developed a concept of carbon debts and carbon dividends to help explain what's going on here. And again, we've got time on the x-axis, and on the y-axis here, we've got net carbon in the atmosphere. And as you can see here, I've drawn two lines. One represents the emissions from a coal burning facility, electric generation facility, and the other is a natural gas generation facility. The first thing to note here is in all the facilities we looked at, biomass emits more CO2 than fossil fuel for the same amount of energy generated. That was consistently the case. We were actually surprised by that. We didn't expect to see that going in. And the sort of implication of that is initially, you're always going to see more emissions to the atmosphere from burning biomass. And that led to this idea of a carbon debt where you see, in this case, you've got about 25 tons of biomass in this example emitted to the atmosphere. The representative level of coal emissions might be around 20, and a natural gas facility, which burns much cleaner, might have emitted only 10 tons for the same amount of energy. So biomass starts out initially in the natural gas comparison, emitting a lot more CO2 to the atmosphere. And right now in New England, natural gas is really the marginal fuel. So if we introduce new biomass generation into the system, what it's replacing is natural gas. Coal is pretty much gone at this point. So you initially start out with a pretty big carbon debt at the moment that has to be recovered through resequestration in the forest. And the point of this graph, I think, really is to point out that it can take a long time for that to be resequestered when you look at it from the perspective of an individual stand, say, or an aggregation of stands across the landscape for a single year's worth of emissions. And that's what we're looking at here. We're really looking at, in this example, 1 year's worth of emissions. You could think of it as one big stand, or you could think of it as a series of stands aggregated across the landscape. But the key point here is, in this case, it might take 30, say 33 or 34 years before the forest is drawn down the carbon emitted to the atmosphere to the point where it's just equivalent to coal. It might take almost 80 years to draw down to the point where it's equivalent to the natural gas emissions. And you don't really start generating benefits from burning biomass until you get beyond that point. So timing matters. Biomass eventually yields benefits, but it takes time. And that's sort of the key point here. Eventually, biomass does become carbon neutral when that line gets back to the point where all the emissions have been recovered, and you can say that biomass is carbon neutral, but the issue is an issue of time and when it's going to happen. And that depends on the initial size of the carbon debt and the shape of that recovery curve. So those are kind of some basic principles here. Now, I think obviously, the problem is not a single year problem. It's more complicated than you see in this particular graph. And you need to extend the problem to a multi-year problem across the landscape to understand what happens over time. And let me just, where'd it go? Here we go. So extending this across the landscape essentially means stacking up those individual recovery curves over time. And in this particular case, you can think of this bottom curve as the first year curve. The second year's worth of harvest become this curve, third year, this curve. You stack them up over time, and arithmetically what's happening is you create this envelope curve if you add them all up, and it flattens out over time, and ultimately reaches a steady state. That steady state, mathematically, it happens really at the point where the first year, eventually all the carbon is recovered by the forest is the point at which that occurs. But ultimately you do reach a steady state like this where essentially your harvest is equivalent to what the forest is taking up if you continue to harvest the same amount every year. You reach that. So, if you think about long-term what's happening in the fossil fuel world, you're ultimately displacing the same amount of fossil fuel every year as well. So the debt I had arrayed as a straight line in the previous examples for a single year. Well, the CO2 from the fossil fuel plant stays in the atmosphere forever. It's never taken up by the plants. So this line essentially is a step function where each year you add the additional fossil fuel if you continue to burn it. So if you continue to burn fossil fuel, it ramps up every year. And at some point, these two lines cross. And that's the point at which the amount of carbon in the atmosphere from biomass is exactly equal to the amount that was emitted over that time period by fossil fuel plants. And beyond that point, biomass is yielding benefits. And in this particular example, that looks like it's at 60 years or something. Key point here is that this equilibrium is always going to be longer than for the single year point at which you start achieving benefits from biomass. And it can be substantially longer because, you're basically stacking up, many years worth of biomass emissions and arraying that against many years of fossil fuel emissions. But eventually you do achieve biomass benefits, and they begin to ramp up very quickly over time because the fossil fuel emissions stay in the atmosphere. Biomass has reached essentially an equilibrium across the landscape, and biomass becomes quite beneficial after some point in time. So that's kind of the basic model that we developed in the Manomet study. And, we kind of refer to this period as the debt period, and this is the dividend period when biomass starts paying off. I think that's in the most simplified way I can communicate it, the basic model. I think in terms of, how this really plays out, I think the thing we learned was that the shapes of these curves, the amount of time it takes, for biomass to start yielding benefits depend on a lot of factors, and it's very site and region specific. I guess really region specific. It depends a lot on what type of feedstock you're burning. Things that would have entered the atmosphere very quickly, um, if there was no biomass or bioenergy opportunity, tend to lead to relatively quick payoffs in terms of biomass benefits. So forest residues, tops and limbs that would have decayed fairly quickly and entered the atmosphere have a relatively short payback period for biomass energy. Mill residues, I think, kind of fit into that same category, as would non-forest wood waste from clearing of power lines or from tree work. Generally wood waste is a feedstock that is probably climate friendly from a bioenergy perspective. Conversely, we found that roundwood that likely would have kept growing absent a bioenergy scenario performs much less well in a bioenergy scenario, because it likely would not have been harvested if there hadn't been a bioenergy demand, and that when it is, it tends to stretch out the recovery period to much greater length. We also found the efficiency of the biomass system makes a difference. Thermal tended to be the most efficient and have the shortest payback periods before you entered the benefit stage. Electricity were clearly the longest because those systems tended to be much less efficient. CHP systems tended to be somewhere in the middle. The fossil fuel you displaced obviously made a big difference. Coal being much dirtier, the carbon debts tended to be smaller, and you tended to reach the payback more quickly. If you were displacing natural gas, as I showed in that other example, it would take many decades longer before you kind of began to realize benefits. And then I think, the forest management approaches, I think we understood less well in the Manomet approach, but how heavily you harvested in your biomass scenarios tended to make a difference. John Gunn, I think, could speak more to that. But in general, how rapidly the forest grew back obviously makes a difference. And the faster it grows back, the quicker you get to the payback period on biomass. I think those, first four things are factors we identified in the Manomet study, and those have held up pretty well over time in the face of more investigation of this problem. They clearly differ by region, they differ by ecosystem, but I think while we were criticized heavily, I think these have kind of stood the test of time. I think an area where we really didn't have an issue in Massachusetts, but that's been identified as a broader issue for this model is we didn't really address, and we didn't need to address market responses across the landscape. And I'm an economist, and I recognize that's a really important issue that merits attention. And the concept there, which I think was originally identified by Roger Seggio at Resources for the Future, is that biomass can affect market prices across the forest industry. And if wood prices rise generally as a result of demands for biomass, it can affect the amount of land that is either brought into forestry. You may have agricultural land at the margin that is brought into forestry. This is, I think, a been demonstrated, I think, quite well for the southeastern United States, where marginal ag land will flow into forestry when prices rise. And that has the ability to, cause more carbon to be produced as a result of the biomass industry prospering. I think it can also, higher prices can lead to intensification of management methods that also can offset some of that carbon debt across the landscape. And in that sense, critiques that we didn't do enough of a landscape analysis probably have some validity. And I think that's an extension of this model that makes sense. And, to the extent that it's relevant to Maine, it probably needs to be factored in. So I think those are kind of the major drivers of how you would think about how to extend the Manomet model to different places. We looked at Massachusetts. We didn't claim that our analysis was the answer for other locales, and I think our conclusion was, you need to look at this on a region specific basis. Just to give a sense of scale, though, I threw this chart in. I wasn't sure whether to or not, but in Massachusetts, we did find, when we looked at this across time and across the landscape, just to give a sense of how long it took for different technologies to kind of meet that intersection point between the fossil fuel and the biomass recovery points. There were huge differences between the technologies. And when we looked at, mixed wood, round wood, and forest residues for oil-based thermal systems, we reached that point where you'd start accruing benefits from biomass in 15 to 30 years. But for gas electric systems, you didn't even begin realizing benefits from biomass until more than 90 years in the future. So, I wouldn't take those too precisely, but the concept here is, for the gas electric, it takes a long time. When you only burned logging residues, the paybacks were much quicker. But still, even in the case of the gas electric, we found it was about 30 years. So, if you're trying to replace gas electric systems, it takes a while before you begin realizing benefits in Massachusetts. Whether that would hold true, looking at a different BAU, business as usual scenario, and bioenergy scenarios in Maine, I don't know. But you are selling probably into the New England, ISO system, and you're still replacing natural gas at the margin. So that's an issue. Finally, as far as the ongoing biomass issues, I just want to tee up a few things that I think are interesting and maybe worth talking here. The first is, I haven't seen that anyone's done a detailed bioenergy carbon analysis specifically tailored to Maine. I know as a result of some of the recent Maine Climate Council work, this may be being considered, but nobody has, as far as I'm aware, developed a specific, reference or business as usual versus a bioenergy scenario for Maine. And it might be interesting to really look at that. There may be some surprises when you do that and start thinking about, well, what is the business as usual or reference scenario? What's it look like? And, what are the opportunities on the biomass side? I think a second issue is the one I referred to just a moment ago about, how would Maine's, wood markets respond at a broader level, and would there be market responses in terms of higher wood prices that might lead to more land coming under forest management, or more intensified forest management that might mitigate short-term carbon debts. I think that's an interesting question. I don't know whether, in the face of trying to displace gas electric generation capacity, whether it meets the test of having any chance of getting there. But it's a question I haven't seen addressed. A third issue is a week or so ago, the state of Massachusetts actually introduced revised biomass energy RPS regulations. There's some new language in there that relates to salvage. I don't know if that's going to change anything significantly or not. I haven't reviewed it carefully, but that has happened recently. Fourth issue, I think there's a question going forward about, even if biomass plants could qualify and receive subsidies under the various state RPS programs, can biomass plants actually compete with natural gas or solar or wind? And I think that's an open question. I know Massachusetts right now has got the highest subsidies it's, I think, ever had for the renewable energy certificates. And there are biomass plants that have participated in the Mass RPS program in the past that have not re-entered the market, even with those high value RECs. So I don't know what the future is. I think there's an interesting question about how competitive can they be in the New England electric markets. A fifth question is, to what extent could changes in forest management or the development of new wood products potentially help offset these early year carbon debts? And I'm thinking, maybe there's an opportunity in the forestry world to find ways to use small diameter wood for things other than biomass that would facilitate forest management in other ways that wouldn't require necessarily selling this into biomass markets for energy. Another question, and this is a big deal, I think. There's been a lot of work going on, I think, in the UK with a new technology called biomass or bioenergy carbon capture, storage, and sequestration. This is really kind of a closed loop system in which, biomass gets used to generate energy, and then all the carbon is captured and stored, I believe, underground, so that essentially the carbon is stored forever. And, in a way, that's a negative emissions technology, which is exactly what the IPCC is saying we need. And that changes the carbon game completely. If that becomes economic, I think the whole biomass world changes dramatically. I know Alec Giffen has heard the pitch for this technology from the power company in England and thinks it sounds very promising. I don't know what level of subsidies are going to be necessary to make this a go, but it may be a promising technology in the future. And then lastly, I raised the issue of whether, rather than thinking about biomass as a short-term bioenergy solution, there's a way to kind of reframe it as a long-term negative emissions technology, not in terms of the carbon capture, storage, and sequestration, but as simply a way of long-term storage of carbon in trees, and possibly arguing that the debts created as a result of maybe even simply harvesting the low-grade material and leaving it to decay in the woods are actually worth the long-term benefits of greater carbon storage in the trees, and that it's worth paying people to engage in greater pre-commercial or early commercial thinning to actually create a long-term negative emissions opportunity in Maine's forests. that's all I have to say. I would open it up for questions if John wants to do that now.
No questions for Tom. He's done. You can go now. No, questions, please. Everybody, Tom, yeah, Tom Rump, I saw your hand first. So
Yeah, just a clarifying question. Tom, in the analysis that was done in all cases, are you just looking at carbon generated through the combustion process, or was this a life cycle analysis including, mining and transportation and all those other outputs?
We actually looked at the life cycle process. So we looked at all the costs involved in harvesting and processing involved in the biomass, and the same on the fossil fuel end.
Dave.
Just a clarification. Tom, you were talking about biomass systems and mentioned CHP. I don't know what that is.
Combined heat and power systems. So you're creating electricity and heat. You've got a load for both.
So Tom, is that somehow that's capturing some of the heat to be used to heat buildings, or is that what?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not an expert, but you could imagine a heating system at a college maybe where they heat the buildings and generate electricity at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So like the Athens power plant, pellet plant has a CHP. So they're generating electricity and using the steam to dry the wood before they make it into pellets.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This, can I ask you a question? This is Denny. I see Stacy Knapp's on the call, and I was intrigued by her point of view or mentioned in the Climate Council that the DEP has ahead of it a consideration of how to capture and understand better these carbon emissions that are coming through biomass. It's not completely well understood, as I remember you saying, Stacy. And could you reflect on the fact of what goes on in a paper mill? Because the paper mills here generate almost all of our carbon emissions from biomass, and they're viewed as carbon neutral. Kind of been grandfathered in, from the original thinking that, biomass was carbon neutral by definition. So could you reflect at all on what goes on in a paper mill? They do take in an awful lot of roundwood, I think. And, but they sort of run a CHP operation. They use the wood to generate electricity and heat. So have you ever tackled that biomass system?
I have not, and I'd really be getting out of my area of expertise to speculate on that. I'm not going to take that one on.
But can I ask Ken, because Ken, the paper, Ken's more familiar with paper mills, and they've been using biomass to heat the facility and generate electricity to run the mill, right? Just I'm not asking for opinion, just factual. It's both heat and power.
So most pulp and paper mills use what's known as hog fuel rather than biomass, which is better known as whole tree chips.
So the bark and the
Yes.
the bark, basically hog fuel, yeah. But it burns, and it both generates electricity and heat
And steam.
Okay, that's
But
a good
Ken,
question, Denny.
But Ken, just to follow up there, the fact that the J mill is closing down that pulp operation because of the foresters around here are really struggling with that because they have no place to take their whole tree chips now. So the paper mills have been an important outlet for for whole tree chipping for woods work, I think. Maybe it's not all of their fuel, but they certainly have been a source.
Well, they use chips for pulp, and they use hog fuel for energy.
No, they use biomass chips for energy also.
Oh, okay. So they're not just using hog fuel.
Yeah. But may not be. I don't know what the relationship to total hog fuel, but I guess we'll be getting to that at some point in the state, trying to figure out what goes on there.
Yep. Stacy's going to figure it out.
So Denny, I can add one more thing. While we have kind of ignored biofuel emissions in past greenhouse gas reports, in this next one we will be including it, and I'm actually working on that now. So we have all of the big facilities in the state have to report emissions to us, including greenhouse gas emissions. So the paper mills are included in that. So they've been reporting their greenhouse gas emissions based on the wood throughput that they report. And we just don't typically include that in the greenhouse gas report because we assume that fuel source, that biomass, is carbon neutral. We have in the past. Going forward, we are going to report it in the greenhouse gas report. So all of those emissions that they've reported to us going all the way back to 1990 will now be reported as a line item, greenhouse gas emissions from the combustion of wood, both for industrial and commercial and residential. So we'll do, and the electrics producing sector. So we'll include all of those. As well as black liquor, which is something a lot of people forget when they think about biomass. That was a big thing for us when we were starting to look at the data, is biomass seemed to be excluded from a lot of back of the envelope calculations. And when we started getting into the details, that was a big one. Mm-hmm. So all of that will be coming to light.
Yeah. Oh boy, aren't you lucky, Stacy? More questions for Tom. I'm going to try to keep us moving here because we've got a lot left to get.
I just have a quick question, and thanks so much for doing this, Tom. So if the fuel mix out there was like it is now, meaning a lot more natural gas instead of some mix of coal and oil, what do you think the public response back then would have been, since it pushes out the equivalency time to 90 years or whatever it is?
Tom Walker, was that a question? That was for Tom, I think.
That was Tom. Yep.
I think it probably would have been more in favor of putting a more of a lid on more anti-biomass, I guess, is the simple answer. I think people would have favored giving more subsidies to the more renewable things like wind and solar.
Okay.
I mean, so much of this is, and Ivan, you're keenly aware of this, is the timing issue. And if John takes a 100-year view, it's kind of mostly good. If you're concerned about what's going to happen in the next 10 to 15 to 20 years, and we're going to hit the 1.5 degree tipping point, that's, this doesn't look so good. So, who's to say who's right? It's another one of those really tough social questions. But what Tom Walker and the team did was kind of lay out the basic blocks of what you need to think about, and then you have to decide what you want to do. And Tom, Walker, help me, if you guys didn't take a policy position, that was up to the DOER to figure out what they wanted to do with this information. And in the end, I think they said, they had a legislative act that said, we've got to reduce emissions in 30 years by X amount. This doesn't get us there in that time frame. Is that fair, Tom?
Well, we definitely did not take a position on this. The state went ahead and essentially built a model that said, you can burn biomass and qualify for the renewable energy certificates if you can meet an efficiency standard. And they used some of our analysis to try to construct a model that showed, what mix of, kind of round wood and residuals you could input to a facility and meet the efficiency standards. And as of today, essentially nobody is, in the Massachusetts RPS market burning forest derived biomass. People have been since 2014, but at the moment, natural gas prices, I believe, are so low that the biomass plants simply can't compete, even if they can meet the efficiency standard with a mix of feedstocks that's available to them.
Okay, we're going to leave it at that and move on to John Gunn, who will give us a specific example of, I think, taking some of those factors that Tom mentioned. Tom, if you, yeah, thank you. John, do you want to, have you got a screen that you'd like to share? Of course you do. And you're all set to go. So just have at it, John.
All right. Great. Well, hello, everyone. So while Tom was able to step away from this issue 10 years ago, for better or worse, I have continued to be immersed in it, mostly in sort of as a bigger picture questions that I'm interested in is in terms of how, how forests are used as now we call them natural climate solutions, but just in terms of thinking about forests as a climate mitigation tool. There are all these different products that that we use from the forest, and so my work has kind of expanded more into some of these life cycle questions, not just with energy wood, but other uses, but then also looking specifically at the response of forests to different management pathways, thinking about kind of restoration, silviculture, and how we shift species and quality in our forests, and then just trying to understand kind of the carbon implications of all those different decisions. So what I'll talk about here is a specific case study looking at wood use for heat in terms of basically residential pellet systems. So not industrial pellets that are exported for electricity. So these are the cleaner pellets that are used in homes. And I'll really use the same framework here. If I jump ahead, that Tom shared here, which as we learned back in the Massachusetts study, this framework holds up well in terms of trying to ask this question about understanding the implications of a new use of wood for energy. So you've got to know something about the feedstock, where the wood's coming from, what kind of energy you're creating, what fossil fuel you're displacing, or I think more, as I'll show later, that that other renewables I think really need to be part of what we're thinking about in terms of that marginal fuel. What are you actually substituting for? I think as the costs of solar and wind rapidly decrease, we have to think about what is that marginal fuel that we're or that energy source that we're thinking about, and then questions about management of the forest. And so what I'll talk about here is a paper that we published a few years ago now. It was work that the Northern Forest Center asked us to do. They had been for several years kind of promoting local wood heat, and wanted to actually be able to talk about the climate implications of that. So so again, sort of using this framework of identifying a baseline case or a business as usual case. You've got to look at the carbon stocks over time, so out in the forest. Look at the other forest sector greenhouse gas implications. So this is the storage in buildings over time. Looking at Denny, the question you had about pulp and paper emissions associated with those mills. So we've built within our life cycle assessment tools some assumptions around the emissions of the manufacture of pulp rather, and making paper. And then looking at fossil heat energy. In this case, what's the equivalent energy source required to heat homes? And so we could think about number 2 heating oil or propane, or air source heat pumps. And then we compare that against an alternate scenario here now, where you're to achieve that same energy outcome, you're using wood pellets that come from a variety of sources, and I'll get into that. And then you also look again at how those forest sector greenhouse gas emissions have changed now that pellets are part of that mix, and then looking at changes in those forest carbon stocks over time. And so when we think about residential pellets, we surveyed about, I think there were 8 or 10 pellet facilities in the region in the Northeast from New York to Maine at the time, and so we surveyed them to get an understanding of their feedstock input. So And it really ranged everywhere from facilities that were only using sawmill residues, so basically, you know, clean, very clean sawdust material, to operations that were using 100% roundwood. But on average, when you looked at those facilities, it was roughly a 50-50 split of kind of forest-based feedstock versus the sawmill residue. An important point here, thinking about that, the material coming out of the forest itself. You know, a lot of in the kind of these bioenergy discussions, people talk about, you know, harvest residues, and in the case of pellets for heat, really a tiny amount is coming from those true harvest residues, so the tops and limbs. It's just not a desired feedstock element for, you know, maintaining ash content standards in pellet heat. So of the wood that's coming directly from the forest, 98% of that is in the form of pulpwood or small trees. So I'm going to show a couple scenarios here that we looked at. Again, this is really an effort to try to understand some of these levers and some of the things that Tom talked about, and the underlying assumptions, and how they kind of play out in what it looks like in terms of changes or net difference in greenhouse gas emissions of using wood for energy or not. So in this market shift scenario, we kind of looked at this case where, let's say you've got a paper mill shutting down in a wood supply area, and a new pellet mill pops up and emerges to basically absorb that feedstock, or that material that was being harvested and sent to the pulp and paper output is now being shifted into making pellets. So what that does is it doesn't change anything in the forest landscape. So you haven't changed any of the management of your forest landscape. You're simply moving wood that was heading into paper and now putting into pellets for heat. The other scenario is looking at that same landscape, and let's say the pulp mill continues to operate, and you pop a pellet mill out in this wood supply area. So the wood has to come from somewhere, and so in this case, an increase in harvest is required to generate the material to go into the pellets. And so, looping it back to Tom's example in Massachusetts. So, you know, in that context, in that study, we looked at the historical rates of harvest in Western Massachusetts, and basically it was hovering around the same amount of acres being harvested every year. And so we made this assumption. We started off looking at, okay, you need 500,000 tons a year to feed this new biomass electric facility. Can you get that from the harvest residues of that existing harvest within Western Massachusetts? And it turns out there aren't nearly enough tops and limbs to supply 500,000 tons of biomass electric. So in order to get that feedstock to feed that mill, you've got to increase the harvest in some way. And the way we looked at it is keeping the same footprint, keeping the same annual footprint of harvesting. We basically increased the intensity, so the tons per acre removed through different silvicultural or different harvest practices. So the unharvested landscape stays the same, and so you really only care about what's going on in the harvested and the managed forest context, which is why we presented all the kind of the outcomes in terms of tons per acres, because we really thought of it as the managed landscape, and that didn't change, whereas the unmanaged landscape didn't change either. So we didn't care about that. Yes, that stuff's still growing, but it's doing the same thing in both scenarios. Sorry, a slight tangent, but this sort of increase in harvest to feed the mill that we looked at in this pellet context is basically the same scenario that we looked at in Massachusetts. And so quickly, kind of looking at then all those life cycle emissions. So we've got this graph shows the difference in terms of percent change difference from that baseline. So the no pellet fossil heating scenario, and we looked at a range of all these different feedstock mixes to try to understand kind of how much it matters if you're one of these pellet facilities that's making pellets purely out of 100% sawmill residues, or if you're on the other end of the mix here and you're consuming pulpwood basically to make that. And so in this market shift scenario, again, no changes in harvest on the landscape. So the forest carbon stocks on the landscape are no difference. So basically we end up with this kind of sliding scale here where sawmill residues perform the best over time in terms of relative to the baseline. And it starts to as predictably kind of creeping up where there's a small net emission when you're using 100% roundwood. And so this is one specific case study, and so the backing up, I guess the case study is a wood supply area, so roughly 50 mile radius from a mill in Maine, where we looked at FIA data and the acreage, kind of the current distribution of stand types, development classes, and we plugged that distribution into a model called 4-Gate that Chris Hennigar helped us develop at Manomet several years ago, that basically consumes thousands of Forest Service forest vegetation simulator runs based on thousands of FIA plots across Maine to generate kind of these forest response curves based on different management regimes. So we allocated those acres within the wood supply area based on the typical silvicultural activities report for Maine Forest Service that put harvest into categories. So shelter wood, partial harvest, clear cut, even age management, that kind of thing. And so, and then in this case, that looked at those changes on the landscape. But again, those changes on the landscape stay the same in both the baseline and in our pellet scenario. Now jumping to, and so this here, I kind of key in on this sort of this 50-50 mix here, which is kind of this average pellet facility that we consider. Now take another scenario here where this increase of harvest, so there are new harvests on the landscape that are required to supply that new pellet facility. And so so you can see again basically the sawmill residues perform well, but the more you mix in the roundwood, the pulpwood, the greater those net emissions differences are from that baseline. And so to put this in kind of another, I guess, another context, this example here is that 50-50 mix in the market shift scenario. So an optimistic scenario where you're simply replacing the consumption of the feedstock with energy wood, and pellets to stack up. And this is kind of similar to Tom's graph that showed this sort of these different relative benefits here. But so wood pellets perform better in that scenario than natural gas and all others. But curiously, this air source heat pump runoff the New England average grid performs better than wood pellets in that scenario. So again, to the point of considering our baseline or our future energy scenario that we're comparing these wood uses against is important. It matters in kind of all these outcomes. And so to me, the upshot of what we've learned over the last 10 years or so is that if you care about the climate impacts of using wood for energy, there are certain things that you ought to be doing, and that's starting with an efficient use of wood. And Tom's charts showed the combined heat and power or more thermal uses of wood are much more energy efficient than using wood purely for electricity outcomes. And the more you can displace these less efficient fossil fuels. So if you're truly getting homeowners to convert their number 2 heating oil boilers into modern high efficient pellet that that's a win in terms of you are really substituting that prior less efficient fossil use. And this idea of the true residues, so the sawmill residues are true residues, true secondary outcomes of forest product supply and manufacturing. And the other piece is this idea of harvest residues. So not every stick of wood that comes out of a logging operation can be considered a harvest residue. I mean, we know what's happening in the forest where basically this driven by kind of a Walmart approach, where if you've got an operation that's got low margins because the energy wood that you're selling doesn't get you very much, then you've got to harvest more of it to basically make the operation pay for itself. And we see evidence of that. There's a paper with Thomas Buchholz and Bill Keaton where they looked at about 35 different harvest operations, and we're finding that when there was an energy market involved, the harvest tended to be more intensive than would have been desired from a silvicultural perspective. So thinking about how do we drive, if wood is being used in energy, how do we wrap our arms around the sources of that material and how that forest is being managed to supply it, because it does matter, particularly in the response of those stands to harvest. And that's kind of related to this last point here, that really there need to be silvicultural objectives associated with the generation of that wood. It's not all wood coming from the forest is not equal, and we shouldn't treat it that way, because it has consequences. So that's my soapbox.
Yeah, that's a good one. It's nice to have those factors put to use, John, in a specific example that people have been talking about for many years now. I guess Massachusetts wasn't as interested in the home residential pellet. They were mostly interested in the electricity, large scale electricity at that time, right?
Yeah, it was really driven by electricity.
And the proposals.
Study.
Yep. I'm going to take one question if there is one. Otherwise, I'm going to keep moving because Ken is going to elaborate on this. So maybe we'll just, yep, go ahead. Yeah, Andrew?
Just clarification. Yeah, your comparison of pellets to air source heat pumps, et cetera, and 50 years was under the pellet. So this is a 50-year time frame. Is that what that analysis was?
Yeah, but it didn't. If you look at, basically this chart here, it doesn't change much in terms of kind of 10, 20, and 50 year, or in this case, it was this scenario right here.
Yeah, it was, if you go forward just a couple. There we go.
Yeah.
So under wood pellets, it says 50 years.
Yeah, and I just picked, it was that, we looked at that basically every 10-year increments essentially, but it's basically the net differences aren't that different at 50 years than they are at at 10 and 20.
Great, thanks.
Okay, if you got more questions for John, maybe we can ask him after Ken, because I want to try to get through this before 5:30. Sometimes we hang out a little longer than that. But Ken, of course, knows the historical data on harvest trends, and somewhere after the Manomet study, Ken got asked the question, now just where is this wood coming from? And he had to wrestle with that question and try to figure it out. So Ken, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. I'm going to look at 4 different topics. Initially, just going to focus on biomass chips because that's the longest trend that we have from the Maine Forest Service. Then I'm going to look at the contribution of 3 major products across time: sawtimber, pulpwood, and biomass chips, which now include firewood and pellets as they got added to the Maine Forest Service wood processor report. Third item is I'm looking at the 4 sources of what I call energy wood volumes that are used in Maine for either generation of electricity or for wood heat. And then as John just alluded to, my final topic is bollwood that is chipped for biomass, or how much roundwood ends up as biomass versus how much limbs and tops get chipped for biomass. And just so you know, the posted version on the discussion group website includes 4 additional slides that provide basically my background discussion for the 3 graphs I'm going to show. So if you want a copy of that, just go to the website. So here we see biomass. The green line is harvest per year. The red line is processed, or essentially what got utilized per year. And it's displayed as a 5-year average. So the Maine Forest Service definition of biomass chips is that these are produced in the woods by chipping any or all of the following: tree limbs and tops, cull trees, and smaller trees not suitable for higher value products. Usually used as an energy fuel, biomass chips may be also used for sludge composting, playground padding, and mulch. Maine Forest Service does not know what the composition is when somebody reports biomass chips. So we started, Maine Forest Service started in 1980 collecting data on biomass chips. Historically, except for 3 periods, Maine has been a net importer and consumer of biomass chips. 2 of these don't show, 1990 and 2003, because it was just a single year within this 5-year trailing average. But we see for the last 3 years, 2015 to 2018, Maine has become a net exporter of biomass chips. So the reason we've been historically a net importer is because we provided a home for biomass that was harvested elsewhere, because we've had the combination of various combustion facilities, standalone electricity generation plants, sawmills, pulp paper mills with cogeneration capabilities. So now we're looking at the average contribution. Again, this was a 3-year average, and shown at the midpoint of the 3 years of the 3 major harvest products. We see pulpwood green triangles, sawlogs are the orange squares, and biomass are the blue squares. Pulpwood has dropped from 65% to around 50% over this 60-year period. Sawmills have sort of ranged between 30 and 40% over the entire period, dropping below 30% back in 2008, and only just now recovering above 30%. Please, you got to recall that biomass wasn't added to this mix until 1980. Firewood and pellets were added to the mix, shown as biomass in 2008. So biomass has ranged from 0 to 10% to a high of 23% in 2008, almost equaling the sawlog harvest for that 3-year period. Now biomass is down to a current share of just a little over 18%. So biomass chips have always been the central and focused target of the conversion to electricity generation, and have always typically been thought of as the top dog. Well, that's not 100% true, because for a 10-year period, they were running number 2. And the volume of biomass has been steadily shrinking since the period started in 2005. It peaked in 2009 at 3.9 million green tons. Currently, the 2018 biomass harvest, it was only 2.2 million green tons. So that's almost a 50% drop over the last 15 years or so. But there actually is 4 different sources of what I call energy wood. There's biomass, hog fuel, which is defined as any woody residue from mills such as sawdust, bark, or shavings that is used as an energy fuel, but has only been consistently collected in the wood processor report since 2001. Then we also have C&D waste, meaning construction and demolition waste, which you see as the green bar. This is ground up woody debris that's left over from construction and demolition that is burned by a wood to energy facility. Has been consistently collected in the wood processor report starting in 2004. And then the last piece that gets added is firewood pellets, which is the purple bar that was added started being added in 2008. So if we look at biomass by itself, it's been up and down across this 35-year period. And it peaked in the 2005 to 2009 period. Hog fuel had a dominant resurgence for 10 years between 95 and 2004. Seemingly as both pulp mills, paper mills, sawmills utilize this product to its fullest extent. But following 2004, we see hog fuel declining, most likely to the loss of cogeneration at several pulp and paper mills closed here in the state of Maine. C&D waste is a pretty minor component in terms of its energy generation, but it is a major imported component. Typically, the import volume of C&D waste is 5 times more than what's generated within the state of Maine. And then lastly, firewood and pellets are very dependent on the public's reaction to current fuel or propane prices, because they choose these alternative heat sources of firewood or pellets when oil and propane prices are seemingly high. So firewood, bounces around depending on people's reactions. So back in 2010, I was asked to try and figure out how much bollwood gets chipped for biomass. And this was one of the tougher analytical nuts I was tasked to do with the Maine Forest Service. So there are 2 available estimates of harvested wood products. We have the Maine Forest Service Annual Wood Processor Report, which collects data from primary wood processors. So in 2018, this was 118 sawmills, pulp and paper mills, 43 portable sawmills, 91 firewood dealers, 118 loggers and brokers who export, 25 concentration yards, and 8 mills that burn some sort of wood for energy. Recognizing that this is not all of the harvest, it does represent a supermajority of processed wood here in the state of Maine, meaning wood that is delivered to a central location, or what I refer to as gatewood. The other estimate is using FIA, and FIA calls it removals. And it's a removal because there was a tree on an FIA plot that was alive and standing 5 years ago. But when we show up on the next revisit 5 years later, all we find is a stump. FIA estimates the volume of that removal based on the characteristics of the tree at the previous measurement. They make no inference as to what got left in the woods or got left in the yard because parts of the tree did not meet current merchantability specifications. So typically, we would expect FIA estimates of removals should be larger than the Maine Forest Service estimates of delivered wood for processing. So without diving too deep, I looked at the period of 1990 to 2006. And here's some of the key points I found. For softwood saw logs, Maine Forest Service estimated 30% more volume than the FIA. Why? Sawmills accept tring length material, some of it which is slashed into logs and pulpwood. The residual chips get redirected to a pulp mill. Softwood sawmills generally accept smaller trees in the FIA minimum of a 9-inch DBH and a 7-inch top diameter. So in effect, some of the FIA designated softwood pulpwood is actually upgraded and becomes MFS sawtimber. When I look at softwood harvest on the whole, Maine Forest Service and FIA were essentially equivalent. Switching to hardwood saw timber, the Maine Forest Service estimate is only 75% of FIA. And my reasons for this is Maine Forest Service volumes actually represent better the market conditions in which saw logs are being purchased. The FIA hardwood saw specs are too optimistic. So in effect, some FIA saw timber degrades due to market conditions to become Maine Forest Service hardwood pulpwood. When I look at hardwood, total volume of hardwood, Maine Forest Service has 11% more volume, which I assume is due to a higher utilization within pulpwood products. Overall, for this period, though, the MFS estimate of saw timber pulpwood is 7% more than FIA, which is a little surprising, but probably driven again by the assumed better utilization of hardwood pulpwood. So I did a bunch of additional assumptions and conversions, trying to figure out which was the best estimate and what's left over. And here's what I come to for final conclusions. The composite estimate of pulpwood or better trees, the bollwood portion, comprises 60% of the Maine Forest Service reported biomass volume. The composite estimate of FIA rotten cull, which is also bollwood and does not meet pulpwood merchantability specs, it is cull, comprises 9% of the Maine Forest Service biomass volume. Therefore, the remaining volume within the Maine Forest Service estimate of biomass is assumed to represent available limbs and tops being utilized as biomass, and as such comprises 31% of the Maine Forest Service reported biomass volume. I presented this analysis to the Maine Forest Products Council in 2011 and was neither booed nor tarred and feathered for outright heresy. I did a calculation last night using the Jenkins biomass component ratios, and I used the most current estimate of trees that were harvested by species group and DBH class. And what I found using that is that estimates bollwood to be 77% of the combined volume of bollwood and tops and branches versus my estimate of 69%. So my last comment is, and most importantly, remember that biomass is whole tree chips, not tops and branches. That's it.
That's your last word, Ken. And we're glad you weren't tarred and feathered because it was a possibility. Tom Walker and John Gunn, does that surprise you? Or maybe you knew this already, 60-70% is bole wood, not tops and branches. Any comment about that relative to your work? Tom, you're
No, I
unmuted.
think that, yeah,
John, go
that
ahead.
was, we tried to estimate. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, John.
You know, we've tried to estimate kind of what's feasible in terms of actually, getting out of the woods and so I think, we generally kind of back into that number a different way, assuming I think roughly 30% or so at least is left in the woods because it's too small, it breaks off, and so using, when we looking at, let's say, FVS models where we're harvesting trees and trying to calculate what's the available volume in tops and limbs, we kind of back into it that way. But Ken, I hadn't seen those calculations that you've done, so that's I think that's helpful going forward to think about that in another way.
Tom,
And,
Also,
this
I
is
mean,
Dave Moss.
Dave.
Somebody else want to jump in?
Let Tom Walker and then Dave. Tom, you have anything to add to that?
yeah, I was going to say, if that is the kind of mix, that would go a long way to explaining why none of the facilities are able to qualify for the mass RPS. They simply have too much whole tree chips in their mix to meet the efficiency standards.
And outdated facilities.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dave.
Ken, I suspect that you were looking mostly at cubic feet, solid wood kind of things, rather than trying to convert all that stuff into tons. Is that correct? Or
So there's no way to get an estimate from FIA of harvested biomass. So that's what I had to do was sort of take saw timber as 1,000 board feet, pulpwood as cords, convert that to green short tons, and then match that up with their equivalents in the Maine Forest Service green short tons. So at the end result was I was matching green short tons, wet tons.
right? Okay, so it was tons, not volume that made a different that you were that was the unit you were using rather than. Yeah. Now, I mean, we've all been on biomass logging operations where whole tree chips, where they just run those logs. There's sticks that come to the landing, through a chipper. Some of them have lost a lot of limbs and foliage along the way, and of course that volume the limbs and the foliage has very little weight anyway. It wouldn't amount to much. So I guess I'm not surprised that it is as high as you say it is. But there is the bark and a lot of other debris that gets thrown into that chipper as well. Do you have any thoughts about that, Ken?
I mean, my experience with chipping operations is, they're trying to produce tons, so they aren't going to mess around with just tops and branches because there's no volume there.
Yeah, but once you, so So you've got a skid full of logs. You take your saw logs out. You take your pulpwood out, and what's left over gets tossed into the chipper, whatever it may be. I mean, and in some cases, you'll harvest some of the pulpwood, right? Because it's inevitably going to end up going into the chipper regardless.
I mean,
that-
in a
So
right world, you would higher value products, so saw timber and pulpwood, and just chip the residuals.
Right.
So can I add something to this conversation?
Please do, Si.
Please do.
Oh, and by the
So-
way, just hang on one second, Si. It's 5:32. If anybody needs to go, please go. We won't be offended, but some of us are going to hang out here because we got nothing else to do. So, Si, please go ahead.
So it's driven by economics. All of this is driven by economics, and biomass is the least valuable piece. On the other hand, if there's an active biomass market, you'll put stuff through. You'll just, you'll take a log that isn't pulpwood or is half rotten, and you'll throw it through the chipper. The last big modeling effort we did in Rumford was based on tons. And so we were very curious as to how much, we had biomass tons, but we wanted to know how much of those tons were in fact traditional forest products, because that's what we were really tracking the tons on. We came up with a 50-50 split, I believe, that that the biomass tons were in fact 50% traditional forest products, because it's really inefficient to try to just chip tops. Or just chip branches. The act of grabbing it with a grapple, stuffing it into a chipper, you need something to make it hang together. And it's much more efficient to have some of the top part of the tree that would have been traditional pulpwood. Plus you wind up with, as Dave said, odd pieces. But it was amazing when biomass first came out, when whole tree chips first came out in the 80s. A number of big operators switched over or added that to their mix. I called two of them a couple of years later after it had been going, and I said, so tell me about the economics of biomass, because I couldn't figure it out. The price was so low, I couldn't figure out how they were covering it. One of them said, I can't figure it out, I don't know it, but I'm doing it anyway. The other one had it figured out. He said, you got to load a van in 20 minutes. You can't haul the wood more than, probably 700 or 800 feet, maybe 1,000 feet to get there. And that's it. If you can do that, you can cover your costs and make a little money at biomass. So it is right at the bottom, very thin margin. And it does have some traditional forest products in it. We used half and half.
So what you're saying is you used 50-50 versus Ken's estimate of say 69%.
Right. And so I'm not arguing with that. I mean, 50 and 70 are close enough together that it's noise at that point. Well, I mean, for this,
okay,
for this
That's
level
fine.
of precision,
I don't want to hear that.
this is the real world, right? Ken,
I'm
you're
closer to 50 than I
fabulous
can
at
say.
mining data. And I'm not going to argue with your numbers. I'm just telling you what we wound up using.
And mine's 60-40.
Yeah.
That's pretty
Okay.
close. Pretty close.
Pretty close.
Okay, I got a question, but I don't want to get in the way of anybody else. Any other questions for? Okay, seeing none, I don't even know how to ask this, but it's to Ken and Tom and John, maybe together. I'm trying to get my head around the business as usual baseline that you use, and the fact that pulp mills are shutting down in Maine, as for various reasons. That wood isn't going to pulp mills anymore because of global circumstances that close mills down. What do you use as a business of usual when you've got these global forces closing down pulp mills? and the business as usual, the wood would have stayed out in the woods. I'm not asking this very okay. Do you see what I mean? You got a moving baseline because of global forces. What becomes the baseline? Business as usual, because that matters to your. Ken's laughing either at me or with me.
I'll add another wrinkle to it, because I think in watching, Maine's total harvest, over the last 20 years, based on the Forest Service reports, as mills have constricted, I think a lot of what happens initially is they stop buying wood from Vermont and Massachusetts and New Hampshire, and so you don't see an impact on a change of harvest rate within Maine, because what they're doing is changing the supply area, and so I think we're going to start to see that impact more visibly in changes in Maine's harvest rate. So not only there's this sort of I guess the global timber markets, but you need to sort of think about that those bigger supply and demand issues, and where you draw your line around the wood supply area or the wood basket starts to matter in thinking about that baseline. I don't have that answer, but that's part of that calculation.
So my comment on the business as usual is difficult to speculate on. Was a fair question. Tom Walker, any thoughts about that?
Well, not to give you an even bigger headache, but I'm going to try. I think we should probably stop calling it a business as usual, because business is not going to be like usual. And I think aside from the things you've identified in the forestry world, the electricity sector is changing dramatically too. And it's not going to look like it does today in 20 years at all. I think the states are moving towards these net zero plans. I think we're going to see lots more renewables. We're going to see changes in how energy is stored over time. The generation shares are going to shift dramatically towards renewables, so that planning is going to have to sort of be very dynamic over time. And our simplistic concept in the Manomet study of a baseline where we just look at a kind of static point in time with gas-fired electricity generation plant and compare that to biomass is, in many ways not very realistic. So I think, really, I can't quite get my head around it at the moment, but, as the world shifts to more renewables and, there's a kind of carbon price out there that's rising over time. I haven't thought it all through, but it certainly has implications for biomass. I don't know exactly what they are.
Well, okay, so I wasn't crazy with the question. I think what prompted it was not only what Ken said in the declining biomass, and I was about to say, why is that? And then he explained that the mills are shutting down. And then we just had the J mill. I don't know, you all probably heard the announcement that the J plant people aren't going to rebuild that pulp machine that blew up last summer. So there's a huge wood basket that I don't know where that's going to go. What's going to happen to that wood that was going to go there? And then what would that mean for the biomass equation? And I guess nobody really knows. Ken, do you have any thoughts about what will happen without that destination?
Some of that has already been reabsorbed by other mills.
Right.
Tappy and Hinckley has upgraded their capacity for wood. Rumford is in the process of upgrading their capacity. So it's a real dynamic. As one market contracts, another one expands, and so it just keeps shifting around the state. Some of that, whether pulpwood can't really, the only export of pulpwood has to go to Canada, because Maine is the only state that has pulp and paper mills in New England, unless you're going to go all the way over to New York.
Right. So the point is that 2 out of the 3 paper machines in J are continuing to run. They need pulp. And Ken has already said that there's, just the fact that the digester blew up and it's a huge disruption, a moderate amount of that same volume of wood is going to go to other places and be made into pulp.
Okay, that's good to know. Yeah, thank you. Okay, well, it's Stacy, it was nice to have you here today. This is what data nerds do on Wednesday afternoon every month. So you're welcome back anytime. It was nice to have you here, and good luck with your calculations over the next year or two. How long do you have to figure out the math of forests and carbon? 1 year or 2 years?
Well, technically I have until next January, but I have to have that time series done like this week, at least for the emissions part.
Oh, well, then then I'm really grateful to have you here today.
Yeah, thanks for the insight. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, folks, well, we'll reconvene. I had a long list of things that you all wanted to hear about. I'll queue up the next one and we'll reconvene in January. As long as you all keep coming, we'll keep talking about one thing or another. So it's good to have you here today, and have a good holiday. And so I thank you for the visuals. Put us in the right mood. Behind you, you can't see them. Okay, everybody, take care. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, John.
Yeah,
Gunn. Thank you,
thanks so
Ken.
much.
Yep.
You're all
Yeah.
fantastic.
Very helpful.
Everybody.
Okay.
Tom, good to see you, Tom.
I do.
All right. Bye.
Take care.